Alrighty, let's talk about step 6, which is when you are persuasive because you're using data in your writing. All right, so what is data-driven writing? It's so much easier to write your narrative when you don't have to come up with everything being unique. It is actually drawing from real data sources. It also builds a much more strong and compelling case. It makes you far more credible and persuasive. And what I think most importantly, it helps establish urgency. Like, fund us now. It cannot wait another year. We really need your support. Let's run through an example. So this is a tiny little section pulled from a narrative, and I'm just gonna read it to you and talk you through it. So they were asking about the financial situation of the applicant. So because Rampart, this is a native tribe in Alaska, because the native village of Rampart is not connected to the road system or an electric grid, the cost of living is extraordinarily high, right? So one sentence describing the section. Alaska is the 4th most expensive state in the US with a price index of 133.2. So that information came from a state report on the cost of living, literally just Googling high cost of living in Alaska until I found a decently credible report. So with Anchorage serving as the base community, the roadless interior had a 2008 differential of 1.31, meaning that the cost of living in Rampart is 31% more than it is in Anchorage. As mentioned in the summary, 60% of Rampart residents are Alaska Quest Card recipients, a food stamp program for low-income households offered through the Alaska Division of Public Assistance. Literally public available information. Just went to the state's website and found that. Got ahead of myself. And then closed with the cost of shipping food by passenger air carrier is almost 50 cents per pound. It's extremely burdensome for Quest Card users and others on fixed income. So that was just a fact that I knew from working with the client on how expensive it is to get fresh food and other sort of necessary items into their community because they can't just drive to their house. So that is an example of packing in a lot of good proving data points that really back up the financial situation for this applicant. You want to be doing the same thing, which is just getting very creative in what you can find to really help make your argument. So very much a critical thinking sport, if you will. Grant writing is definitely where you deploy those skill sets. So then obviously one of the most common things you're going to need is demographic data. It's just a must use resource when you're building your argument for your narrative. So you can get from the census website, I'm showing the US version, but wherever you're watching this from, your own countries should have one of these resources and something similar as well. So you can discover what's the poverty levels in our community, what are the education levels, how about the median household income, and food stamps, etc., right? So we are not going to go deep into census.gov stuff right now because it's a rather intense topic unto itself, but former student of Grant Writing from Start to Funded, Alexis Swenson, actually taught this for us when we updated the course, because she just went way deep on the new census website and just became a total subject matter expert, which is awesome. And so that is, who covers when it's not really just me teaching you things, it's actually a whole team. She talks about the census website. So check out data.census.gov to start getting comfortable with the census data. Not gonna lie, I kind of miss the old website. The new one's a little bit clunky to use. So just go get in there, start experimenting. If you're finding yourself super overwhelmed, we'd love to have you in Grant Writing from Start to Funded, where we give a more detailed tutorial. Let's talk about writing persuasively. So first of all, let's just remember, grant writing is persuasive writing. There's a lot of people just like you that are deserving of funding, but there's not enough for everybody. So you need to be writing from a place of how can I be most persuasive that we need this funding? You need to be able to move your reader emotionally, whoever is reviewing your application, the organization that you're applying for, right? And we don't want to just explain what you're doing. We want to show why you're doing, like that bigger picture of why it matters so much. And why we like to also do that is that it establishes urgency. Because if it doesn't feel like this problem needs solved like yesterday, then you might not get funded because maybe they'll apply next year and we can get them then. We want to be funded now. So let's run through a couple of our top tips for how to write persuasively. Okay, first one is you have to convince yourself to your core why the project is important. So our lead project manager, Alex, was actually just over here between filming this, and she was on a kickoff call with a community, and it's a housing project. And she said that she cried in the kickoff meeting because it was so moving about why it was needed. Like the community was talking about the problems that they're trying to overcome, and she and then the lead grant writer, who's actually Alexis on this project, like they were emotionally moved. They know why it's important. They personally now have heart and soul to put into this application. They know in their core why this project needs to happen, and that will now come through their writing in a way that it wouldn't if you don't genuinely believe in it. So convince yourself to your core that why you're working on what you're working on matters. So why does this all matter? I want you to think beyond just also why it matters to you, but think about why does this matter to our community? What other things could happen because this project happens? A lot of times there's a little bit of a domino effect, right? Like if you make this happen, what else can happen, right? And then what happens if it's not funded? Does that mean that like literally the whole program's cut? Is it drastically reduced? Like what are the impacts to real people's lives if this doesn't happen? And then also it's important to kind of do the zoom out, get that 30,000 foot view and figure out what are the regional implications. So maybe you're working on like a homeless initiative or addressing a homeless problem in your community and you're like, if we don't solve this, these are the ramifications. You want to be able to have those kind of thoughts and be able to kind of noodle and write those down because those need to be baking into your narrative. All right, tip number 2, this one is so important. You've got to be so clear on what problem it is that you're solving. A lot of people try to get projects funded because it's a good idea. And that is not what motivates a funder, right? You have to put yourself in their shoes. Like we need to be solving real problems, right? We need to be tackling things that are tough and solving it creatively. And so if you cannot connect what you're doing to a specific problem, then the problem is you can't basically articulate when you've succeeded. So you can't say, hey, we have drawn change. This is the impact we've had if you can't show that before-after scenario. So that's why it's really important to be clear on what is the problem here that we're solving. Tip number 3, answer the narrative questions exactly. This seems so basic, but really it's an easy one to get carried away with. So sometimes a narrative is going to have 5 questions in it, and it's easy to maybe only answer 3. You need to be really, really, really specific about answering every single thing they want and very, very clearly. So for example, if they say, describe the project beneficiaries, which is basically that word means describe like who you're serving. The first sentence of your response in the narrative needs to say, the project beneficiaries are. Like that obvious, right? Like whatever they're asking for, you retool right into your sentence to respond and answer to that narrative question. Tip number 4, you really want to leverage your grants like dominoes. This is a little bit of more of a conversation with how you put together your budget and why we talk about putting funding strategies together, because usually it's not just one grant, you need a couple, and it's important to figure out the strategy in terms of which one goes first. That'll knock over the second one and the third, right? But the idea is you want to be writing into your narrative, hey, if we get funded by your organization, we expect that to unlock our ability to pursue this foundation, because maybe even talk to them and say, would you support us if we're funded by Foundation A? Chances are pretty good because sometimes nobody wants to be maybe the first in, right? So you want to be able to paint like this whole picture of these are all of the things that we're pursuing. You kick it off. So your investment is going to go so much further than just the dollar you put into us. Like we'll leverage additional dollars. So I hope that makes sense because it's a really big strategy tip in terms of how you make people feel like, wow, we are having a really big impact. We're getting a great ROI on the dollar we spend here. So I want to give a quick example about that. So there was a philanthropist that gave $25,000 to this new nonprofit. Actually, she ended up partnering with an existing nonprofit and they became her fiscal sponsor, which is a whole nother topic unto itself, but you don't necessarily need to start your own nonprofit. You can work with another. And so that's what she did. And so this philanthropist gave them $25,000 unrestricted funds. But before she spent it, because she took our class and she learned this strategy, she used that as leverage to go pursue another 2 grants, which actually totaled $86,000 more. Had she spent that $25K, she would not have been able to use it as leverage, as match for the other grants. So she got, at the end of the day, over $100,000 out of that $25,000. So that's some of the strategy that you want to be thinking about, right? Let's see, back to number 5 tip. Present your project team very confidently and prove why they're the best. So if you don't have the A team, who can you partner with? Can you partner with another nonprofit? Can you partner with literally an infinite number of other organizations so that you are bringing together the dynamite team? There's 2 common issues that we see people run into. Sometimes you're a really tiny team, and so it's like, well, yes, I will be writing the grant, implementing the project, doing the reporting, and it's like, well, that's a very vulnerable state for the funder, because what if you quit or something happens to you? Then their funding might not be managed properly because it was all hinging on you or a couple people. So it's important to show you have a whole team, because maybe one person won't be there forever. The other thing is, it's really important to present that the team has recent and relevant experience pertaining to the specific project that you're trying to get funded. And recent would mean anything in the last 5 years. So it's important to get a copy of people's resumes, not because you rarely include them, but so that you've got that content and you can bake that into writing about your team. Now, as it relates to building a strong team, as I just said, think way beyond your organization's boundaries. Super important to think, well, who else can we partner with here? Just be honest, because if you have an area that's weak, you know it, and the funders are astute, they're smart, they're gonna see it too. So just address it in your project planning and make sure you have a dynamite team. And then, as I already said, make sure you have recent and relevant experience. Alrighty, next tip is having a really great plan to make your project happen. And this is the part that I know is not always the most fun, to sit down and just do some good old-fashioned planning, but it goes a really long way. A lot of times what we see is that people say, well, we'll figure it out once we're funded. That might be a little bit true, but you do not want your funder to know that. You want to be really presenting yourself like, hey, we have a game plan, you fund us, we're hitting the ground running. So 2 of the most common reasons that people don't get funded is because they really aren't ready. So if you want to position yourself better for success, like let's say you did get turned down, but you have good reasons to apply again next year, invest the time and the resources to further plan your project so that your details really are worked out, because that stuff takes time and energy. So it's important to have a good project plan. So here is a sample layout that we provide in the course to make this much easier. You might consider using a table layout when you present your work plan, because it just helps make it more visually easy for the funder to understand, okay, these are the very specific tasks, when they say they're going to get them done, who's doing it, the objective, right? And then that really helps with being evaluated and showing, okay, they really do know what they're doing, they've got a plan. So that is a helpful approach, so it's not all narrative, like writing based. So that's all I want to talk about in terms of some tips on writing persuasive and how to start baking in some data into how you write. We are then going to roll into our last video on this section, step 7, and I will see you there. Alrighty, take care.